All right, now I say this is one story. It's a prevalent story. It has widespread acceptance in our culture, and whether we are scientifically educated or not, we've heard that story in outlines, and it shapes to a significant extent our public discourse, metaphysically speaking. But it's not the only prevalent story in our culture that tries to address those same sort of metaphysical questions about the nature of the universe, where we came from, and so forth. So I want now to change colors again and start over. Okay. Suppose we draw a line here, and we start off with the same phrase, in the beginning. Dot, dot, dot. What was there? What happened? How did we get to be where we are? Right, a dramatically different story that we're familiar with, and I'm going to call this the creation story. And this is the story that is at the heart of all of the major Western religions: Judaism, its later offshoot Christianity, and a later offshoot again Islam. The story as we find it in Genesis, right, that traditional story, also has an answer to the question in the beginning that gives an explanation of our origins, why the universe is the way it is, and why humans are the way that they are. In the beginning, according to this story, what we have is God. Right? God is that which exists, and God is the only thing, right, that exists. And if we ask what God is, we say that God is, in some sense or other, a spiritual being. He's not a material being, not a physical being. He's non-physical, non-spirit, or non-material, and so purely a spiritual being. So in the beginning there was God, and then the next significant event that happens is God decides to create the universe. So we have the creation of the universe by God. And I want to pause here and say, and ask the question, how this occurred, right, according to Genesis. When we say that in the beginning there was God, and then after there was God and God's creation, how did that occur? I mean, what did God do to create the universe? And here we have to pause because both in Scripture and in the major theological traditions, there are two accounts of the creation, and there's a fairly lively debate over which account should be given primacy or whether they can be integrated in various ways. And so, not to step on anyone's theological toes at this point in the course, I'll put both of them out here, and then we can reunify the story a little bit later. All right, so I'm going to call them Creation Story 1 and Creation Story 2. Okay. And the first story of creation is to say, in effect, that God created the universe by speaking, right? And God spoke, right? If you use that metaphorical language there. Or sometimes this account goes by the Latin name of creation ex nihilo, right? That there was God and there was nothing, and in some sense, God brought forth his creation, the universe, out of nothing. So we have a miraculous event where from nothing creation comes into existence, right? Or that from God speaking, creation comes into existence here. So I'm going to call this the Emanation Approach. I think that's the best label here. Slightly technical word. But if we take this seriously, the idea that God spoke, right, and things came into existence, and what we're saying is, metaphorically, that in some sense God is projecting himself, right? The speaking is coming from God. There is nothing else except God, and so in some sense what happens is God speaks, and from God then the universe comes into existence. So I'm going to call this the emanation doctrine. Now, the second creation account that we can find in Scripture and has theological backing for it argues that in the beginning God existed, but God was not the only stuff that existed in the universe, and it relies on formulations such as God brought order out of chaos, right? Or God acted on the void and brought creation into existence that way. So the idea here is that God's creation is more analogous to the creation that a sculptor engages in, where the sculptor begins with some raw material, some clay or whatever that's just in a lumpy, unformed, chaotic state, so to speak. And the creation, what we call the artistic creation or the sculptural creation, is a matter of the artist having a conception that he or she then forces on the chaotic material to structure it in a way that suits his or her purposes. So I'm going to call this doctrine the forming the formless interpretation. And the idea of it is then that we have some formless stuff, right, as well as God existence, and what God's creation amounts to is imposing structure, law, order, regularity, design upon that formless stuff, thus bringing the universe into the state that we know it to be. The other version, the emanation version rather, denies that there is anything in the beginning other than God, and so it explains the creation in terms of some sort of a projection or externalization or expansion or emanation of God outward into the material universe as we know it. Now, I mentioned there is textual evidence for both of these that one can find in Scripture, but there are also theological issues that have been kicked back and forth that lead one person or another to adopt one or the other of the models. If we take the emanation model, for example, it makes sense to say that in the beginning God was everything, and so the universe must come from God in some respect. But this approach runs into a problem that's traditionally called the problem of evil, which in a nutshell is to say that there's lots of bad stuff, or there are lots of imperfections, or there are lots of outright evils that exist in the world. And if the world is God's creation and everything comes from God, how could there be anything imperfect or not quite right or outright evil in the world? The emanation doctrine seems to imply that if everything came from God, and if God is perfect, then everything that comes from God should be perfect, so the world should be perfect, but it isn't. So the emanation doctrine has a problem. That's a kind of reasoning that leads people to move more strongly in the forming the formless direction, because it can explain more easily the imperfections that exist in the world. We can start saying things like the reason why there are imperfections in the world and bad things in the world is that the raw material that God was working with, the chaos, the void, or whatever we want to call it here, it itself has its limitations, and only so much can be done with it. And so God, with his powers, brought a perfectly good conception, an intent to the project of creating the world, but given the limitations of the raw material that he was working with, the resulting product, the universe as we know it, is then a mix of good and evil, right? Or a good and bad, or perfect and imperfect. The imperfections can be blamed then on the raw material, and the elements that are good or perfect are the elements that are God's contributions there. Now that solves the problem of evil metaphysically, but it does itself have its own problem, because if we then start saying things like, well, God did the best that he could with the materials that were available to him, but there was only so much that he could do, then we are challenging the omnipotence of God. We are placing limitations on God, and that also is a position that is theologically fraught with difficulty in the Western religious traditions. And so not wanting to place limitations on God's power to create whatever kind of universe that he wants to create, that is to say, not denying God's omnipotence, which this position seems to commit us to, people then are led back to the emanation position, and so the debate then goes on. I don't want to pronounce on that debate, just to acknowledge that there is such a debate and carry on the story for our purposes here.